wonderful series of the Sikh Studies webinar. We have a very special guest today to talk with us about the exciting things that are happening in the University of California system, and also in particular what's happening at UC Riverside. But before we begin, let me just say a word about this whole series. And for those of you who may not have been a part of the first discussion 2 weeks ago, and why I'm doing it. I'm Mark Juergensmeyer, and I'm at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And years ago, I used to teach at Punjab University, and so I've had an association with Sikhs and Sikh Studies most of my adult life. And maybe 45 years ago, in 1976, Guru Singh and I started the first Sikh Studies conference in the United States. And we've been friends ever since then. And as you know, Narinder Singh Kapani was the founder of the Sikh Foundation. And so a few weeks ago, just right before his untimely death, shortly before Christmas, Narinder called me up and he said, Mark, he says, you know, we had this Sikh Studies conference so many years ago in 1976, the first one in the United States to kind of assess the state of Sikh studies in North America and really around the world. He said, I think the time has come to do it again. So, but in a time of pandemic, we can't physically bring the people together. So let's have a series of discussions, conversations with the people who are the leading figures in the field. And then he said, I'd like to ask me, Mark, to moderate. And I was very flattered, and I said, Narinder, I'd be delighted to do it. So that's why I'm here. And I did hold the Kundan Kapani Chair in Sikh Studies at UC Santa Barbara for a number of years, and now the current chairholder is Anju Malhotra, who was our guest 2 weeks ago. But today we have a very special guest, my good friend Pashaura Singh from the University of California at Riverside, here to tell us a little bit about what's going on at Riverside and what's going on in Sikh Studies everywhere. That's what we're trying to figure out in this series. And we begin each one of these conversations, Pashaura, with breaking news. So I understand there's some big things on the way at UC Riverside in Sikh Studies. Can you tell us about it?
Good morning, Professor Juergensmeyer. Thank you for having me on in this conversation. Well, we are planning to have 7th International Online Conference in Sikh Studies on May 7th and 8th of this year. So this is our 7th conference at UCR. And the theme of the conference is Sikh Studies in the Western Academy, exploring its prospects and challenges. Basically, what you are doing in your webinar series, it is a full-fledged conference on the same sort of theme. And we are also trying to make assessment of where we are and where we should go, and what we have learned from the past experience. And new generation of scholars is now coming to the horizon.
Yeah, I remember Pashaura 2 years ago when you had a conference at Sikh Studies at Riverside, and I came to it, and it was a wonderful occasion. It was, as you said, as you know, like your plans for the upcoming one. It included older scholars as well as younger scholars, a lot of graduate students, people who are just coming up in the field.
Yes.
And everybody was together in the same room. Now, let me guess that everybody is not going to be together in a same room in a super spreader event with no mask. But the whole thing will be on Zoom, right?
Online, yes, Zoom, yes.
Yeah.
We have about 20 scholars have already sent their proposals. So it's going to be a very exciting event. The important thing about this conference is that we are dedicating this conference to Dr. Narinder Singh Kapani in his memory. And I want to share a very interesting story about Dr. Kapani. It is about a phone call he had with me in December 2007. In the summer of 2007, UCR administration had decided that they will not have Sikh Studies chair at UCR. So the decision was made, and they were looking at, various logistics.
Now this, you were already there, right, at the time?
I was there, I joined University of Riverside in 2005.
Oh, and they were going to like terminate the position?
And not my position, I will be continuing, but because I was originally, I applied for UCR chair in the beginning, but then there was a lot of opposition within the South California Sikh community. Some vocal members of the community had, put pressure at the university administration. But they, of course, they selected me and appointed me, made my appointment, but I was just teaching in the Department of Religious Studies. And then they said, well, we will postpone this establishment of endowed chair. Anyhow, for the next 3 years, they were just debating and trying to convince the Sikh community that it's a good idea. But suddenly, there was a lot of pressure, and in the summer of 2007, university administration decided that they will not have endowed chair. So my position was secure. I had no problem, but I was worried, because if there's no Sikh Studies chair, after me, there will be nothing in the area of Sikh Studies. So at that,
the great thing about establishing a chair is that you have a line of scholars. It's
right.
just not just you, but that means that in perpetuity, in the future, there will always be somebody to teach Sikh Studies. Now we've at Santa Barbara, for example, now we're in the third chair, the Kapani chair of Sikh Studies. And as you say, after you, I'm sure you're going to be teaching forever and never, ever retire, but just in the case that might happen, then there would be another scholar of Sikh Studies to replace you.
Yeah, that's right. So then there was the American Academy of Religion meeting at San Diego. And I also attended that meeting. It was our first panel in Sikh Studies, and we were just trying to make the Sikh Studies group in the AAR. On 18th November, in the Sikh Studies business meeting, all the present scholars, who were present there, I told them that this is happening, and UCR administration has, made the decision that there will be no Sikh Studies chair. So then, what happened was that all the scholars, they said, let's write a combined letter as a petition to a UCR administration. So then about 10 scholars, signed that letter, and they said, well, they made the point that UCR by so doing, by not establishing the chair, may have appeared to succumb to the pressure offered by a very small, though vocal minority, who had in the early 1990s successfully bullied the University of Toronto to abolish its own nascent Sikh Studies program, to the great detriment of students and scholars of Sikh tradition. Anyhow, it's a long letter, very convincing letter. And
but you said Narinder Singh Kapani played a positive role at this point?
Not at this point. This is November 18th, and then, we wrote the letter and we requested the university to reconsider its decision.
Yeah.
And university, then started thinking about it. There was a reconsideration, and they approached Dr. Kapani in December, about 21st December, he was to go to India at that time. And then Dr. Kapani had about 1 hour long conversation with the provost, dean, and all other vice chancellors in the development side, So after that conference call, Dr. Kapani called me and gave me the whole, gist of the conversation. He said, that I told the administrators that you are committing suicide by not establishing Sikh Studies chair. We have deposited the money 3 years, 4 years ago, but our, aspirations are, you are doing something, it's a suicidal attempt by the UCR. So anyhow, he was very angry and he made a sort of, he roared like a lion in the conversation.
Right. Well, that's so much like Narinder. He was so dedicated to the field of Sikh studies.
Yes.
And for him, I'm sure he liked you as a person, but for him, it wasn't personal. Ultimately, it was a matter of principle. That the field of Sikh studies should thrive and it should endure, right. And that endowed chairs are a good way of doing that, regardless of who might be the temporary shareholder. This is something for the future. Right. And he was very cognizant of the fact that what he wanted to build was not just a temporary kind of fix, but create a field of Sikh studies that would thrive and that would endure for the future. It was a remarkable vision and a profound one, and I think we're seeing the value of it. But let's get back to your the conference in May, right? May?
Yes, right. Yes.
Yeah. So who will be there? Do you have? Can you reveal some of the names to kind of give us an indication of what might be happening?
All the scholars are coming. Those who have accepted. I sent invitation to basically all the scholars, but 20 scholars. Graduate students from England and also from UCR will be attending. Then basically this is the event.
So it's mostly younger scholars.
Younger scholars and also senior scholars, particularly scholars associated with Punjab Research Group in the UK.
Now excuse me for interrupting, but I wanted to ask a question. I'm sure that a lot of people watching this may be asking. Can they join in? Can they participate? Can they watch and ask questions? Oh, by the way, speaking of asking questions, I should have mentioned at the outset, if anybody watching this has questions for Pashaura Singh, we have a Q&A section on Zoom. Just post your questions there. And then a few minutes when we get to the question period of our discussion, then I'll quickly look at those and we'll ask as many of the questions as we have time for. So we don't have a chat function. We have the Q&A if anybody has any questions. But anyway, getting back to what you were saying, I apologize, Pashaura, for interrupting.
Yeah, because, after 1984, Punjab Research Group started, International Journal of Punjab Studies and Chandra Thandi and Guru Singh, Dr. Preetam Singh and Eleanor Nisbet and Ian Talbot, all these people, they were pioneers in that attempt to start something going on in the field of Punjab studies and Sikh studies. So we will be recognizing their effort, those pioneers, who started the International Journal of Punjab Studies. And
so I was asking you, can anybody log on? Anybody who's interested, or
anybody can join? Anybody. We will be sending the link to all interested in. People can join and watch and participate.
So if somebody watching this is interested in participating and observing the conference, what should they do? Should they send you an email note or what?
They will have to register for the conference. We are in the planning stage. Once the program is set.
Okay, how do they register for the conference? Who do they contact?
We will send, our department, staff member will send the link and everything. We will send the registration form first, So we want to,
Right, but I was asking if somebody is watching this and they are not on the mailing list, should they just check the website of the program of Sikh Studies at UC Riverside, and then there'll be
UC Riverside,
instructions.
Sikh Studies chair website, yes. Yes.
Okay, so that's the answer. So if you're interested, just keep checking the website of it's called the Sikh Studies program at University of California, Riverside, and you'll find some instructions there on how to register.
Right, yes.
Great. Okay, because we have a lot of people who are interested in participating, and they want to know, what they can do and how they can do it.
Right.
Okay. So say a little bit about what's going on at UC Riverside. You have, you're a part of the same consortium on Punjabi language that Anshu Malhotra was talking about 2 weeks ago, the University of California, or do you teach Punjabi on your own?
I teach classical Punjabi to graduate students. That's different from modern Punjabi. I knew about this Punjabi program on January, actually 7th in our department meeting. In that meeting, Nicole Ranganath, from UC Davis, also she participated, and she gave the report. For the first time, I learned about this whole project, and I was quite pleased. And our university, our department was also pleased, that something is solid is happening in the field of Punjabi studies.
So at UC Riverside, if you don't know any Punjabi at all, are there beginning classes in Punjabi, or do you have to know Punjabi in order to be able to take your classical Punjabi classes?
My graduate students had no knowledge of Punjabi when I taught them, so we have to start from the beginning.
Oh.
But that is a different course, It's classical Punjabi is, Christopher Shackle has prepared a textbook, an introduction to the sacred language of the Sikhs. So we use that textbook, and also a Guru Nanak glossary, These two textbooks are very useful for learning classical Punjabi and grammatical constructions of scriptural passages of Guru Granth Sahib. And by going through that textbook, it takes about 2 years for completing those textbooks,
Right.
So I had my students, Charles Townsend, Toby Johnson, and others, they took early, but now 2 more students, Tejpal Singh and Gurbir Singh Sangha, they have taken this course with me.
So how many graduate students do you have, Pashaura, and how many have you had? What's the total number of graduate students who have been through your program at UC Riverside? Because there are very few programs in Sikh Studies that actually have Sikh Studies on a graduate level. That's why what you're doing is so special, and why I want to, to focus on that.
Yeah, I so far I have supervised 4 graduate students. Charles Townsend, he completed his dissertation in 2015. The dissertation was Music in the Guru's View, Sikh Religious Music, Memory, and the Performance of Sikhism in America. So he is now associate professor at Octon Community College in Chicago. So that's very fine piece of scholarship, that he created. He interviewed so many budding musicians, young children learning Sikh Kirtan and so on. So basically, it's an ethnographic study of present generations, who are doing music and so on. So he's doing really well. Then second graduate student was Toby Johnson. He completed his dissertation on living and learning with Guru Nanak, participation and pedagogy in the Janam Sakhis. He also defended his dissertation in 2015.
And he focuses on the Janam Sakhis.
Janam Sakhis, actually, he goes beyond the framework of Professor MacLeod.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, he advanced the field on Janam Sakhis. And he is currently he's working as assistant professor, visiting assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies, University of Lynchburg in Virginia. So both are.
And then you currently have a couple graduate students?
I have two current graduate students, Tejpal Singh Baniwal. He has defended his actually a comprehensive exam in this spring quarter. And he is writing his dissertation on pioneer Sikhs, and by applying the current race theory. So that's what he's interested in, particularly Gurdwara Stockton, because he has a lot of material there, the minutes of executive committees, decisions and so on. So he has archival material to look at those, Gurdwara Stockton will become basically a case study for his dissertation.
So speaking of graduate students, your own graduate studies were at University of Toronto, as I recall.
Yes.
Many years ago. And Pashaura, am I right? Somebody told me that originally back in the Punjab, you were a grunty?
Not in Punjab. In Delhi, I was teaching at Guru Harshan Public School for 7 years from 1973 to 1980. In 1980, I was invited by Calgary Sikh Society. Dr. Tariwala was the one who basically went there in New Delhi, and interviewed me. We had long conversation, and then they invited me, my whole family actually, my wife, my two children.
They invited you to Calgary
to work for Sikh Society, Calgary, and work as a Granthi at the Guru Nanak Center, but also I was...
That's wonderful. I mean, I don't know many scholars who have actually had a religious function and then went from there to actually scholarship on the tradition. That's just wonderful.
Yeah.
So then you already, of course, had something of an academic background, but when you were at Calgary, then why did you decide, well, this is just reading the scriptures are not enough. I need to study them. How did you come to that conclusion?
Actually, Dr. Tariwala told me, that we will help you to study at University of Calgary. So I started taking up courses in textual studies, method and theory and all that as a classified student. But then they had graduate programs. So I was again accepted in the graduate program. I did my master's degree again on Bhagat Bani, So Dr. MacLeod also visited Calgary, and he was my external examiner for my dissertation.
Right.
Then, I was accepted in the doctoral program at the University of Toronto, where Professor MacLeod was a visiting scholar for 5 years.
And he was the only one really teaching Sikh studies at Toronto at the time, or were there other people who also?
There was no one else, actually the Calgary professors, Dr. Harold Coward, Professor Neufeld, they advised me that you cannot do PhD in Sikh studies under our guidance, but you will have to work with somebody who's a specialist in the field of Sikh studies.
Yeah, and at the time, there were Sikh studies virtually didn't exist.
No.
Anywhere in North America.
No.
So
no
to
one
have
will accept you as a graduate student in the field. So
yeah. So to have even one person in all of North America who knew something about it was a real advantage. Otherwise, you would be pretty much left on your own trying to.
To work with him was a bittersweet experience,
Yeah.
He was a highly controversial scholar, so I had to share that honor with him.
Right, but that's not, the way he does scholarship is not necessarily the way you do scholarship. The point was that he knew something about it, and he knew the text, he knew the language, and you actually had proper mentorship. And of course, that's exactly what we're trying to do now in North America and the UK, is really develop the field of Sikh studies so that the new Pashaura Singhs who come along, the new graduate students, have mentorship. And they have people who know the scholarship, even if they don't agree with it, even if they disagree with it, that's okay. That's what happens in scholarly traditions. You're supposed to disagree with your mentors, right? On scholarly issues.
Yes.
But to learn from them and to learn the skills and the techniques and the knowledge, and the language and the tradition, all of that is very special. And you were very lucky to have that kind of mentorship.
Yeah, it was
And
a
that's
privilege.
what you're trying to do for new generations.
Yes.
Yep.
It was a privilege to work with Dr. McLeod.
Yeah.
I know he was excellent supervisor. He allowed me to become my own person. At times I disagreed with him, but he was quite happy, pleased.
Well, because I knew him at the time, and I know that he was just really thrilled to have you as a graduate student,
Yes.
in part because he came from New Zealand
Yes.
at the University of Otago in Dunedin, the southern tip of New Zealand, where he didn't even teach Sikh studies. There was no interest in it whatsoever in the university. So he didn't even have the luxury of teaching Sikh studies. Because I remember we invited him to Berkeley. I was at Berkeley at the time to teach a course on Sikh studies, and he was thrilled because he wasn't allowed to teach that in New Zealand, much less have an actual real live breathing graduate student. So he never had that luxury in New Zealand. So he was just so proud of you. And so delighted to be your mentor. And so you were very fortunate to have, it's kind of like being the only child in the family, to have all of the love and affection that a larger family might get spread among a lot of students, and you were it. And so I'm sure he was thrilled.
Yeah. Let me share with you a very interesting story about Professor McLeod. He passed away in 2009. And in his will, he had a great collection of books and other sources in the field of Sikh studies. So he said, that, wherever Pashaura Singh goes, he will have the first opportunity to have his library, so when he died, we in our department, I said, let's have Professor McLeod's library at UCR. So my department colleagues were very supportive. Professor Ivan Stensky particularly, took great interest. He basically, offered, monetary help in this project. So we basically got the whole McLeod library at UCR in 2011.
It probably had some very rare manuscripts as a part of it.
Manuscript, more than 3,000 volumes, all that stuff is now at UCR. I mean, so far as resources in the field of Sikh studies, our university is at top, basically everything is available to graduate students to do, their research. So we established McLeod collection of Sikh studies at UCR Rivera Library. So
and just to remind people that when you say UC, I've been calling it UCR, we're talking about the University of California at Riverside.
Right.
one of the distinguished campuses of the University of California. And being more so every day, and part of that distinction is that it was one of the first campuses to have a chair in Sikh Studies, which if you're just now signing on, Pashaura Singh is the current chair holder. Now, Pashaura, before we turn to questions, because I see that there are quite a few questions that people have, and I want to turn to them. But I always ask the people with whom I'm having these conversations, the big question of what Sikh Studies is and where it's going, because you've been in this field all of your adult life, and from your graduate student days to the present, you must have seen the field of Sikh studies change quite a bit. How has it changed, and where do you think it's going?
It's changing, this new generation of scholars are applying new methods of looking at Sikh tradition from sociological angle. My student Gurbir Singh, for example, he has a degree in sociology undergraduate degree, so he will be looking at diversity within the Panth, all the sects and groups within the Panth, right from the days of the gurus to the present, So he wants to do sociological study of Sikh tradition, Sikh Panth, and the groups within the Panth, diversity within the Panth. And I mean, there are so many scholars, who have applied different methodologies. Feminist scholars are doing, Sikh women scholars are doing feminist, interpretation. And for example, Arvind Bandeir is applying philosophical lens to look at Sikh tradition. So Sikh studies is basically growing now. Field is not limited to textual studies or history of the Sikh tradition. We are moving to different areas now.
Yeah, I noticed that, when I was at your conference 2 years ago, and you were very nice to present me an award, which I greatly appreciated. And I think I said at that conference that I feel like I don't deserve this because I'm old fashioned. So I'm of your generation, or rather older. and, and for me, I've kind of identified Sikh studies as being primarily a study of texts and early Sikh history. Which of course you do brilliantly, and that you based your credibility of your scholarship in that area. And yet, as your own work has said, is shown, and it's been really interesting to me to see your own research and writing develop over the years. And you've reached out into other aspects, into the diaspora community and the expansion of Sikhism and Sikhism around the world. And so now, if you're a sociologist like me, or if you're an art historian, or if you're studying music, there's a place for you in the field of Sikh studies.
Yes.
And as I looked around the room 2 years ago, I saw that most of the people there did not do the kind of traditional textual studies. Not that that's not important; it's still very important.
Right.
But it's just that the field is so much broader now. And,
right.
And I think that's what you're saying, right?
Yes. Sikhism is a global religion now. It's not limited to Punjab and India only. So we need to look at diaspora Sikhs. How, and that context is very important to understand the Sikh tradition. Diaspora city, that framework is needed to understand what's happening in Canada, UK, North America, USA, and everywhere, around the world. Sikhs are spread all over the world. So we need to look at different dimensions of Sikh tradition, Sikh communities. So these are.
So how do you see the future developing? Do you think this will continue, or do you think there'll be a revival of interest in?
There's a great interest among the young scholars. Originally, I had only non-Sikhs, Charles and Toby doing Sikh studies, Sikh scholars, so I had some difficulties in inspiring the Sikh youth to come. But now I have 2 young Sikh scholars, and others are coming, and so there's a change. There's a great deal of interest, among new generations.
Well, that's good to hear, because at one time I had the impression that Sikh families in North America, one of their children become doctors or engineers, and they thought if they went into history or the humanities, they were kind of lost souls. But you see that there now is a revival of interest among the diaspora community of really taking up the scholarly sword and to moving ahead in a way that blazes a trail for a whole new kind of scholarship.
Yes. I mean, in my Sikhism class, for example, number of Sikh students they're small, number 5, 10, sometimes 12, but large majority is non-Sikhs, I have a cap of 35 students in my Sikhism class, so, but their interaction when Sikh students and non-Sikhs interact in the class, looking at the same question and debating on those issues, that is wonderful to see Sikhs interacting with non-Sikhs and how non-Sikhs are interested in the field of Sikh studies.
But the majority of your students are non-Sikhs in your
yes,
undergraduate classes. Yeah.
yes.
And why are they there? Just curiosity, or they have a
I
Sikh
mean,
girlfriend?
they are learning about Sikhs, and they write beautiful term papers,
Yeah,
sometimes better than the Sikhs. Sikhs take it for granted that we know everything.
yeah.
We have learned from the parents, but they do research. Non-Sikhs, they dive deep into research articles and so on. Then they write their term papers. So from that angle, I enjoy the reading, writings. Uh, but
So,
Sikhs,
so some of them are better than your Sikh diaspora students.
yeah,
Well, I won't tell anybody.
yeah,
Well, Bashar, let's turn to some questions. Let me just take a look and see what are some of the questions that we have. Well, here's a question about the relation we've just been talking about, the development of Sikh studies, and the question about the study of the Sikhs in diaspora. And you yourself have written on that, right? And can you tell us a little bit about that, of the state of Sikh studies of Sikhs in the Sikhism in the diaspora, and the Sikhs as a community in the diaspora, and Sikhi as a way of life in the diaspora?
yes. Sikhism or Sikh tradition in the diaspora is basically, evolving in response to the local conditions. So it's definitely different from what you are looking at the Sikh tradition in Punjab or in India. Sikh tradition in USA, in Canada and UK, it's a different tradition because they're evolving in response to their own situation. And I wrote on millennial generation of Sikhs, one article on that, young Sikhs, how they're growing up in a different context. They are different. It's a different generation.
And yet I see a revival of interest in
Yes,
the tradition among young people who
yes,
were born in the United States or Canada,
right.
and are really enthusiastic about embracing the tradition. At UC Santa Barbara, we have a Sikh Studies Students Association that's very lively,
Right. Yeah.
and Bhangra dances, they get really very committed to keeping the elements of the customs and the tradition alive.
Yeah. So we have Sikh Student Association at UC Riverside as well. And they're highly motivated. They have bi-weekly meetings and so on, doing kirtan, participating in Gurdwara worship and community kitchen, langar, So they are highly, highly motivated to understand Sikhism.
Is that you see this? I mean, this seems like a big change, because I remember back when I was at Berkeley, a lot of the younger generation of Sikhs would the Sikh guys would shave, and they would
Yeah.
they wouldn't go to Gurdwara. They were trying to assimilate, and
Assimilate.
assimilate meant that you had to abandon those customs that they associated with the Punjab. But it seems like just the opposite today, where people are proud of their heritage and they want to embrace it, and they want to show the world that they're Sikhs and they're proud.
Yes, my two doctoral students are basically wearing banas, Nihang banas, they are Khalsa Sikhs, and highly motivated to study Sikh tradition very critically. So there's a change. There's definitely a change. When I came in Calgary in 1980, it was a different Sikh community.
Yeah.
And I look at the next generation, it's totally different, At that time, they were encouraging the young children to cut their hair and assimilate, but now they are proud of their identity and they want to maintain their identity.
And that raises another issue, which Professor Hawley on our question and answer has raised, and that is that there are now a number of women. The number of women in Sikh studies has increased, and the interest in the role of women in the Sikh tradition has increased. Is that true?
Yeah, that's very true. Yes, number of women scholars are coming to the forefront, and we
But
just
all of your doctoral students, at least so far, have been guys, right?
yes, 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 yes,
But this is not true of your undergraduate classes. They're much more gender mixed.
yes, gender mix. Yes,
Right. Yeah, and it will be, I'm sure that we'll get other scholars in the webinar who will have, other takes on this subject. But I think you're right. This is one of the important developments
yeah,
in Sikh studies is understanding the role of women in the Sikh tradition, and also women Sikh studies scholars who are interested in this. I'm getting back. I'm reading these questions as we're talking. There's some particular questions. Somebody wants to know the name of that student who is working on the Janam Sakis. Uh, can you tell us who that is?
no, I don't know.
Oh, okay. Then let's see. Oh, interesting. This question is whether how. I think the question is whether the scholars of Sikh studies in the United States and Canada, UK for that matter, whether they interact with their colleagues in the Punjab and elsewhere in India. In other words, uh, how how isolated is the scholarship, or do you have regular contact with scholars in India?
We do try to interact with scholars. Sometimes, I went to attend a conference in Chandigarh in November 2019 when they were celebrating Guru Nanak's 550th birthday. So I have interaction with number of scholars from India, but then there are some Sikh scholars. I was to go to Punjabi University. They started uh, criticizing the vice chancellor and programmers, to invite me. So there are some bickerings among those scholars, particularly at Punjabi University, Patiala. Uh, they are basically, they do not interact with us. One scholar from Punjabi University, one woman scholar came here to attend my conference. So we welcomed everyone. I invite number of scholars, send an invitation to come and participate in the conferences. We are always open. We have, I mean, scholarly disagreements are always going to be there, but we need to promote the field and advance collaboration, interaction with others. So we are open. We are inviting everyone.
Yeah, I mean, that raises an interesting question. I remember that the old generation of scholars like Pritam Singh and Harban Singh and Jagtar Singh Grewal
Yes.
used to regularly come to the United States, and scholars in UK, Canada, and the United States were regularly in contact with them. Of course, Grewal is still with us, which is
Yeah.
wonderful. The others have gone.
Yeah.
Um, but and we still have that that memory, and that effect of that interaction remains. But
Yeah.
it seems to me the younger scholars are kind of mired in their own institutional issues, the way you describe,
Yeah.
uh, and have not been involved as much. Maybe that's just my grumpy old man perspective,
Yeah.
but I don't know.
Yeah.
But there is some very good scholarship, of course, going on in the Punjab
Yeah.
and India in general in the field of Sikh studies, and so I'm sure that you are in connection with at least some of your colleagues there and find them to be useful resources.
Oh, yes, yes. I visited Guru Nanak Dev University Library. The vice chancellor was very, very helpful. I used all the sources, and then I met with number of scholars there, uh, Dr. Jubinder Singh and others. So I do interact with scholars who are.
Well, what about the UK? Of course, we're going to be talking with some people from UK in this series, and we'll get to know a little bit more about what's going on there. But do you have, and in Europe, do you have continuing relations with scholars there?
Yes, I do. I was basically, I attended Upinderjeet Kaur Takhar, had organized her first conference to.
It will be speaking with her in 2 weeks, in fact. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So I delivered a keynote there. So we are basically collaborating with all these scholars, and I have invited them to my conferences.
Mhm.
So basically, scholars in the diaspora, they have, worked really hard to understand new methodologies, new methods and theories to look at the Sikh tradition. Definitely, there are going to be differences between the approach followed by the scholars in India and Punjab universities. But we need to, collaborate. We need to cooperate to
Yeah,
advance.
so back to the question, we have a question from Professor Fenich regarding getting Sikh studies into the into high school and pre-college education. I know this is always a challenge for us in the colleges and universities. We're stuck in our own,
Yeah,
postgraduate kind of bubble. But have you had any requests, or have you involved in any way to try to help in pre-college education in the high school, elementary schools?
Sometimes, some schools have invited us, to give a talk on Sikh tradition and so on. So I have visited 2 schools, but it's not a common thing. Those schools who are interested to learn about Sikhs, so we encourage, we do provide them, sources and, but my graduate students, for example, they are much more, available to school students and so on. Yeah, because they
Yeah, I think it depends upon where you are. I know in Northern California, particularly in Yuba City and Marysville, we have a huge Sikh community.
yeah,
There is more of an attempt to have Sikh studies as a part of the high school curriculum,
yes,
simply so people can get to know their neighbors, to have a multicultural study. If there's in areas where there's a large Sikh community, that makes a lot more sense, of course.
right,
It is necessary in a way that may not be in areas where you only have, a couple of Sikh kids in your classroom.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Other questions? We have a really big question by one of our participants who wants to know, what is a Sikh? How do you that's a question that we've been wrestling with in the field of Sikh studies ever since I can remember. But I assume you don't confine it just to the people who keep the 5Ks, that you.
Yeah. Well, the scholars have written books on who's a Sikh, Our book is discussing this question. At least minimum definition would be who believes in the teachings of Guru Nanak. That is the beginning from Guru Nanak's times. So that is a fundamental requirement to be a Sikh. Then you come to the Khalsa and so on. But there are all kinds of Sikhs within the Sikh community, and all are part and parcel of the large non-Kleva followers, who are having faith in the teachings of Guru Nanak and his successors and the Guru Granth Sahib.
Yeah, I mean, you could say in a larger sense, the word simply means, Sikh means a learner, anybody who is trying to learn from the group. Yeah. But I think it's an interesting question, especially recently, because of this emphasis on the concept of Sikhi, the Sikh way of life, and as a kind of defining or distinguishing characteristic. And what do you think of this trend, this idea, and which has become kind of a major idea within particularly young people in the diaspora?
Because they are challenging the colonial constructions of Sikhism. Sikhism became a well-defined system through the efforts of Singh Sabha scholars, and it became a well-defined system, and it became a religion in the Western sense. Sikhi is ever evolving, the path of discipleship, way of living, how you practice Sikhi, practice the faith and teachings of the gurus and in the living experience. So that is Sikhi. Now even scholars are challenging those constructions of, construct Sikhism all the time. But that has become so dominant in the area. I mean, if we say Sikhi, no one will understand what you are talking about. So they know now Sikhism as a religion and is part and parcel of the religious traditions, and as a global religion, it's more, but they are putting a lot of emphasis. Post-colonial scholarship is basically challenging colonial constructions.
And do you think this is a good thing?
It's a trend, after 10 years or so, this will change to another trend, so it's ongoing sort of happening. It will change.
But it makes its own contribution to the field of Sikh studies. We have a question from Dr. Rishi Singh regarding importance of language training and whether you can really have Sikh studies without having the appropriate languages, particularly, of course, Punjabi, but also, Persian, Braj,
Yeah. So we have, I require my students to take up Punjabi language, classical Punjabi, and then Persian language, Urdu language, and then also, Sanskrit or Hindi, at least, because most of the sources are in Persian language and Urdu language, Hindi, Braj Pasha. So they have to learn all these original languages in order to look at the sources.
But if the student is interested in the characteristics of the Punjabi community or diaspora communities from a sociological perspective, for example,
Yes.
then I assume that the emphasis on language is rather less.
Yeah, because they are studying the society and the language they're speaking is mostly English, and they can do without language.
Mhm.
But if you are working in the original sources, you have to learn those languages.
Right. But what about, I mean, I remember I first studied Punjabi because I was a sociologist and wanted to interview people out in the villages and at least know enough language to be able to
Yeah.
communicate or work with a translator to be able to communicate.
Yeah.
But for a lot of my other work, it's not essential. But even if you're doing Sikh art and music, you probably have to know some Punjabi, right?
Yes. They have to have, yes.
Mm-hmm. And can you explain why that is? I mean, you take art as art, it's just pictorial representations.
Music, anyone who is working on Sikh music, he has to learn Gurbani, he has to learn scriptural passages in the original language. And only then he or she will be able to understand the real music, So yes, everyone has to learn Punjabi language, classical Punjabi as well.
As you say, even art and music, dance, if that's, or I'm just thinking of some of the topics that came up at the conference 2 years ago, including fashion. And Bhangra rap, But I guess even for that, you should know, because we'll put it this way, because so much of culture is embodied in language.
Right, yes.
That even if you don't use the language in order to understand the culture, it's valuable to have language skills.
Right.
Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, excellent. Yes. Bhangra dance, if you don't know the Punjabi language, you will not understand those versus bolis, that they recite when they're dancing. So yes, Punjabi language is a must to understand Sikh culture, and Sikh culture is based on the Punjabi language.
So I have a question from a scholar from Pakistan regarding the new venture of President Imran Khan in Pakistan to create a Guru Nanak University at Nankana Sahib.
Yes.
And is this a project, are scholars of Sikh studies abroad or even in India involved in this in any way, or is this solely a Pakistan effort? Do you know anything about it?
I know about Pakistan, Baba Nanak Group University. I think they have already established it. They are going to, and diaspora Sikhs are part and parcel of that project. I know a person from England, who was basically doing all sorts of efforts to establish Guru Nanak Dev University, Baba Guru Nanak Dev University in Pakistan at Nankana Sahib. So they are going to introduce Sikh studies, and they have equal right on Baba Nanak. As you know, they have opened the Kartarpur corridor. That's a huge project.
Could you tell about that? Have you been to Nankana Sahib? Because now it makes it possible for Indian scholars, Sikhs, to go to Nankana Sahib in Pakistan.
I visited Nankana Sahib in 1999. I went there for a week. I also visited Kartarpur at that time.
Yeah.
Renovation was going on at that time. It was Dr. Gurcharanjit Singh Atariwala who had established Guru Nanak Fellowship, Shrine Fellowship in Calgary, and they supported that project. And originally, basically, in 1992, Dr. Atariwala went there, and the Gurdwara was in a very bad shape. There was Kartarpur. So he pushed his friend, General Dad Khan, who was also eye specialist, to renovate the Gurdwaras. So they started that project. And now Kartarpur corridor has been opened, and it's a renovation. It's a big project. It's the biggest Gurdwara in the world at this moment.
Well, that's really exciting. I remember, since I'm an American, it was easy for me to go to Pakistan years ago. And years ago, I went to Nankana Sahib, and you're right. At that time, it was in somewhat of a state of disrepair.
Right.
But interesting to me, that worship was going on, but not by Sikhs, but by Muslims who were doing namaz, doing prayers, and regarding Baba Nanak as a peer, as a kind of a saint. And to me, it was so striking and reflective of Punjabi culture, and particularly what Punjabi culture must have been before partition, where people could so easily respect each other's faith, and Muslims were, appreciative of Sikh tradition, and Sikhs could go to a peer. In fact, remains one in Hoshiarpur, an ashram that from a Muslim peer kind of left over from pre-partition days, and most of his followers are Sikhs and Hindus. So that kind of appreciation of spirituality, whether it's Muslim or Sikh or Hindu, seems to me a part of the Punjab tradition, at least before partition. And I saw some of that when I saw the Muslims praying, doing namaz at Baba Nanak's birthplace in Nankana Sahib.
Actually, at the common level, I visited Nankana Sahib in 1999. So I met with people. I went to Punjab Sahib. I was given so much respect and honor. I felt that I'm at home. So there was no feeling that I'm at in a foreign country or anything. So at the common level, people to people contact is very much positive development. With Kartarpur corridor opening, it has done a huge favor to the Sikhs, and Pakistan deserves compliments for that project.
So what we've really come around to at this point in the conversation is that the Sikh studies really is a global field.
It is a global field. Yeah.
Yeah, and it developing not just in the US and Canada and the UK and Europe and India, but even Pakistan. Who would have thunk that?
Pakistan, there are scholars who are working in the field of Sikh studies.
Yeah,
A recent graduate, Khola Chima, she has completed her PhD degree in Sikh studies.
hey,
Young scholar, bright scholar, and they are also running webinars, Lyalpur Young Historians Club, I was part of that project as well. I spoke there. So, I mean, that kind of feeling at the common level, people to people contact is happening. Uh, Leave aside the politics between the two countries, so, but people are, they love each other.
well, Pashaura Singh, this has been a wonderful conversation. We're kind of up at the end of the hour, but you've shown in this conversation why you've been such a rich resource to the field of Sikh studies, and how important your work and your leadership has been to developing the field, for which we all are full of admiration and appreciation. So I want to thank you for all of that, and particularly being our guest today and helping us understand how Sikh Studies is developing not just in the University of California system, but around the world. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to the next discussion in a couple of weeks. I know we didn't get around to all the questions, but don't worry, we have more sessions and more opportunity to chat with our guests in the weeks to come. So thank you, and I'll see all the rest of you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Juergensmeyer.
Bye-bye.